Moving on in this chapter, today we see the second topic under peasants and agricultural production. तो हमने इसके पहले वीडियोस में peasants और agricultural production को a little bit of detail में discuss किया है, a bit briefly हमने इसको discuss किया है. इसका पहला topic जो हमने पढ़ा था, it was about the kinds of sources that we have from where we derive our knowledge about the peasantry or about the agrarian society that existed during the Mughal period. So today we talk about peasants and their land. So जो peasantry होती थी उनके पास हमेशा land होता नहीं था. So there were those peasants that owned some acres of land. There were those peasants also that didn't own any land at all, because most of the land in the villages, most of the cultivable areas in the villages were owned by what we have now come to refer to as the land owning classes. तो ये जो लैंड ओनिंग क्लासेस होते थे इनके पास बहुत सारा जमीन होता था, और जो है ये पेजेंट्स जो है इन लैंड ओनर्स के जमीनों पे काम करते थे, इनके खेतों में काम करते थे. तो so peasants were those lower class of lower strata of the society, of the agrarian society, which weren't very rich and which didn't have much land holdings. So whatever Indo-Persian sources that we have regarding the peasantry and the kind of land holdings that they had, so in these sources the peasant has been referred to as these words Raiyat, Muzarin, किसान, असामी etc. तो हाँ ये चीजें ये words use किया जाता था peasants को refer करने के लिए. So these are what the peasants have been referred to in the books, in the sources that we derive from this period. So there were two types of peasants. We had like two divisions of peasants. One was the khudkasta, जो कि होते थे residents of the village where they held land. So these were those peasants that had land holdings, so they held land and they lived, and obviously if they held land in a village, then that meant that they are going to be living in that same village, and they cultivated their own lands. So these were the peasants who were a little better off, and these were the peasants who didn't depend on landowners' lands to for a source of livelihood. तो ये जो हमारे पास पहला कैटेगरी है पेजेंट्स का, इनके पास अपनी जमीन होती थी, ये उसी गांव में रहते थे जिस गांव में इनकी जमीन होती थी, और ये अपने जमीन पे ही खेती करते थे. ये लैंड ओनिंग क्लासेस पे डिपेंड नहीं करते थे. तो ये थोड़े से बेटर ऑफ थे, ये थोड़े से वेल ऑफ थे, ये थोड़े से ज्यादा these came a little above in the hierarchical strata that we see has existed in agrarian societies. So these peasants were a little better off. The second type of peasantry that we see is the pahikasta, जो कि होते थे non-resident cultivators. तो ये cultivators होते थे. These used to be peasants. They worked in they did farming, they did cultivation. However, they cultivated lands on a contractual basis. So these people, they did not hold land. So ये second category जो है हमारे पास peasants का, इन लोगों के पास अपना land नहीं होता था, और ये लोग जो है किसी और के जमीन पे खेती करते थे, and so this is what we refer to as tenants. So these people used to work on somebody else's land, and they would get paid for it in terms of cash or in kind, in terms of the a share of the produce that they have helped to cultivate. तो ये लोग contract basis पे काम करते थे किसी और की जमीन पे, and so these people, they also frequently, since they didn't have land in their own villages, frequently they would often have to live in other villages to work on other people's land. So these peasants were also non-residential. And the reason why they cultivated lands on a contractual basis was either out of choice or compulsion. So when we say out of choice, it means कि या तो ये अपनी मर्जी से किसी और की जमीन पे काम करते थे, या ये कंपल्शन से किसी और की जमीन पे काम करते थे कॉन्ट्रैक्ट बेसिस पे, या तो ये देखते थे कि कहीं पे इन अ नियर बाय विलेज वहां पे जो रेवेन्यू टर्म्स है किसी की जमीन पे काम करने के जो पैसे आ रहे हैं उससे ये लोग ज्यादा कमा सकते हैं इंस्टेड ऑफ working in that same village, or instead of working in their own land, even if they had land. So if the terms of revenue were better, then they would out of choice move to a nearby village and they would work for somebody else's land, or they would do so due to compulsion. And when we see compulsion, we mean either they are not getting work in their own village, or maybe there's any form of economic distress in their own village. So in that case also they would go to a nearby village and work for work in somebody else's land. तो ये या तो अपनी मर्जी से करते थे क्योंकि वो देखते थे कि किसी आसपास के विलेज में इनको ज्यादा अच्छे पैसे मिल रहे हैं किसी और की जमीन पे काम करने के लिए, या ये देखते थे, या इनके पास कोई चॉइस जब नहीं होता था, जब इनके पास इनके विलेज में कोई काम अवेलेबल नहीं होता था, या इनके विलेज में किसी तरह का इकोनॉमिक डिस्ट्रेस चल रहा होता था, किसी तरह का भी famine, drought, whatever. So ऐसे सिचुएशन में भी ये लोग नियर बाय विलेजेस में जाके सेटल होके वहां पे दूसरे लोगों की जमीनों पे खेती का काम करते थे ताकि इनको जो है ये पैसे मिल जाए फॉर वर्किंग ऑन अ कॉन्ट्रैक्चुअल बेसिस. So these are the two types of peasantry that we had. Moving on, peasants in North India own just a pair of bullocks and 2 plows, or even less. So in northern India, what we see is, so peasants do not own a lot of land. So these first category of peasants that we just talked about, this was indeed a very uncommon sight. So peasants meant that they didn't hold much land holdings. In fact, they just owned a pair of bullocks and 2 plows. So इनके पास थोड़े बहुत farming equipments होते थे. So these are all farming equipments. और इनके पास अपना जमीन नहीं होता था. So और अगर इनके पास जमीन हुआ भी करता था किसी टाइम पे, तो these were like not very educated people. These were not literate people. They wouldn't understand terms and conditions like things. तो ये जो land owning classes होते थे, a lot of a number of times these landowners would trick these peasants into selling their land or into mortgaging their land, and sooner or later they would somehow acquire the land that would have been owned by these peasants. So frequently, in a number of cases, the peasants also lost their lands for this purpose only, because the landowners would trick them into giving their land away. So it was a common sight कि peasants के पास अपना खुद का land ज़्यादा होता नहीं था. So we see how in different states different sizes of land holdings would be owned by peasants. In Gujarat, if a peasant owned 6 acres of land, it meant that he was a very affluent peasant. It implied an affluent peasantry. मतलब अगर एक peasant के पास 6 एकड़ की जमीन है तो मतलब वो काफी अमीर है, काफी वेल ऑफ है, काफी affluent है. अगर बंगाल की हम बात करते हैं तो अगर किसी पेजेंट के पास 5 एकड़ की जमीन है तो दैट वाज द अपर लिमिट. उससे ज्यादा जमीन किसी भी पेजेंट के पास नहीं होता था, नहीं हो सकता था. बियॉन्ड दैट इट वुडंट बी पॉसिबल फॉर अ पेजेंट टू own any land holding which is beyond this size. So 5 acres was like the upper limit of average peasant farm. Also, if anywhere in the country we saw a peasant holding 10 acres of land, then that implied a rich peasantry, a rich Assami or a rich peasant. So just says कि मतलब बस 10 एकड़ जमीन होना मतलब बहुत बड़ी बात थी उस टाइम पे पेजेंट्स के लिए, क्योंकि कहीं कहीं पे तो हम देखते हैं कि 6 एकड़ मतलब वो उसको काफी, गुजरात में अगर 6 एकड़ जमीन है उसके पास तो मतलब उसको काफी अमीर माना जाता था. बंगाल की अगर हम बात करें तो 5 एकड़ से ज्यादा हो नहीं सकती थी पेजेंट्री के पास. So if anywhere in the country we see a peasantry holding 10 acres of land, then that was a big deal. Then it meant that the that the peasantry was actually quite rich. So these were the various types of land holdings that were owned by various sizes of land holdings that was owned by the peasantry in our country. Moving on, cultivation was based on the principle of individual ownership. तो कल्टीवेशन जो होती थी वो इंडिविजुअल ओनरशिप पे बेस्ड होती थी. किसी पेजेंट का अपना फार्म है तो वो खुद उसमें खेती करेगा. If he doesn't have a farm, then if he doesn't have a piece of land holding, he would be obliged, he would be sort of forced to work on somebody else's land, and तो जिसका वो land है, that person has more rights to be produced, more claims to be produced than the peasantry does. But anyway, so this was how this would work. Also, peasants' land bought and sold like the lands of other property owners. So peasants का जो land होता था, it was like there was a sort of class hierarchical division existing in rural society. There was a lot of caste divisions existing in rural society, but somehow when it came to land, there would be no divisions. The land of peasants would be purchased and they would be sold in much the same way as the lands of other people. तो मतलब लोगों के साथ डिस्क्रिमिनेट किया जाता था, लोगों के साथ कास्ट और क्लास के बेसिस पे डिस्क्रिमिनेट किया जाता था. बट जब जमीन का सवाल आता है तो पेजेंट लैंड होल्डिंग्स वर नो डिफरेंट फ्रॉम अदर लैंड होल्डिंग्स, एंड दे वुड बी purchased and sold by people just like anybody would deal with a normal property. So that's all that we have here to learn about peasantry and land holdings. Moving on, we will be studying a couple more topics under peasants and agricultural production, and this here is all that we have about the peasantry and the kind of land holdings that they owned in our country back in the Mughal period.